So, this is how the day detonated. Donald Trump went after Canada in public, in person, and with the kind of aggression that leaves no room for retreat. A burst of social media attacks, an unscripted press gaggle, a series of threats aimed straight at Mark Carney and, by extension, the entire Canadian state. But within hours, Carney answered in a way that changed the meaning of the whole confrontation. Not with outrage, not with slogans, with action, cold, layered, calculated action. By the time the trading day ended, the verdict from the markets was already written. Carney had taken the round decisively. And the deeper story was not just about trade, tariffs, or diplomacy. It was about the contrast between two kinds of leadership. One side arrived with insult and impulse. The other arrived with preparation, timing, and a plan that looked as if it had already been rehearsed for exactly this moment. That is what made this clash so striking. Trump improvised in front of cameras. Carney moved like a man opening a folder that had been sitting on his desk. Ready, waiting, tabs marked, numbers checked, allies pre-briefed. This was not a balanced exchange. It was impulse versus discipline, noise versus structure, emotion versus preparation. And when those two forces collide in a geopolitical crisis, the side with the homework usually lands the harder blow. Even Warren Buffett, in what became one of his sharpest comments on leadership during the trade conflict, would later frame the entire day around that difference. Leaders who react and leaders who anticipate do not just produce different headlines. They produce different costs for their countries. And that difference, once exposed in public, is impossible to unsee. The timeline matters because every hour made the contrast uglier for Washington and stronger for Ottawa. At around 6:30 this morning, a pre-recorded interview with Mark Carney aired on Canadian morning television. American business networks picked up parts of it not long after. The tone of the interview was calm, measured, almost restrained. Carney spoke about Canada's trade diversification, new bilateral links with the European Union and Indo-Pacific partners, and the energy export infrastructure being built toward Atlantic and Pacific terminals. He laid out how Canada had been quietly redesigning its economic architecture in less than 2 years. There was no chest thumping in it, no theatrical flourish, just data, policy, and the voice of someone describing a plan already in motion. Then came the line that cut through all the rest. Carney said Canada's economic future was no longer hostage to the decisions of any single trading partner. In other words, the quiet message under the polished wording was unmistakable. Canada was signaling that it no longer intended to live at the mercy of Washington's moods. And that, more than any spreadsheet or trade statistic, was what triggered the explosion. Because for a man like Trump, the policy detail is never the most offensive part. The insult is the suggestion that someone no longer fears him. According to reports circulating out of Washington, Trump saw the segment early in the morning while watching cable business coverage in the residence. He reportedly reacted instantly, turning to an aide in disbelief that Carney had said such a thing on television. Whether everyone in the room fully caught the remark no longer mattered. Trump had already locked onto it. And once that happened, the machinery of impulse kicked in. By roughly 7:15 this morning, he was posting. Not one message, not two. 6 posts in the span of about 45 minutes. Each one angrier than the last. Each one more personal. Each one a little less disciplined. The first post cast Carney as the most ungrateful leader of any country and insisted Canada would be nothing without America. The second accused Canada of exploiting the United States for decades and complained that Carney was now going on television to boast about it. The third escalated further, threatening the most severe economic measures ever imposed on a so-called ally. And then the tone shifted from hostile to openly personal. Trump attacked Carney's Goldman Sachs background, branded him a globalist, questioned whether he was even truly Canadian because of his years leading the Bank of England, and dismissed the Canadian economy as a weak system surviving only because America allowed it to. It was the kind of posting spree that may feel powerful in the moment, but strategically it was a trap built by the author himself. That is the part too many people miss in real time. A public threat is not just a performance. It is a commitment. Every sentence spoken in anger can become a policy expectation by the next news cycle. And if those threats were never vetted, never modeled, never coordinated with the agencies that would actually have to execute them, then the problem gets bigger with every minute. That morning, Trump was not just insulting Canada. He was cornering his own administration before most of it had even fully started the day. Reports suggested senior economic officials were blindsided. One advisor supposedly learned of the posts from a cable news push alert. Another had not been briefed in advance because there was nothing to brief. The trade apparatus, the commerce team, the National Economic Council, all the machinery that is supposed to translate presidential rhetoric into viable state action appeared to be reacting after the fact. That alone tells you everything about the nature of the opening strike. This was not a coordinated move. It was a grievance with a phone attached to it, and that may create drama. But drama is not the same as leverage. At around 8 this morning, Trump doubled down during an impromptu press gaggle on the South Lawn before heading to an event. Live cameras were rolling. Every major newsroom was watching. And instead of softening the message, he expanded it. He went beyond the social media barrage and laid out 3 specific threats. Possible banking restrictions on Canadian financial institutions operating in the United States, an immediate freeze on Canadian energy imports, and possible initiation of withdrawal proceedings from the USMCA. Those were not vague complaints anymore. Those were concrete economic threats delivered to the world in real time before the administration had fully stress-tested any of them. And this is exactly where the opening move began to rot from the inside. Because once specific measures are announced in public, the burden shifts from performance to feasibility. Can it be done legally? Can it be done quickly? Can it be done without detonating damage across your own economy? Can your own agencies even defend it in court or in the markets? Those questions should come before the cameras. On this morning, they appeared to be coming after them. Reports indicated that one senior economic advisor was seen immediately trying to determine whether the president's unscripted promises were even within legal reach. Another appeared visibly shaken in the background. That image alone captured the state of play. The cameras saw confidence. The officials behind the curtain saw a possible crisis. And once that happened, Trump had built a lose-lose box around himself. If he walked the threats back, he risked looking weak in the eyes of his supporters and his rivals alike. If he pushed forward, he risked implementing policies that had not been legally checked, economically modeled, or politically insulated. In other words, before the morning was even over, he had created a situation where backing down was humiliation and following through could be self-harm. That is not strategic intimidation. That is strategic overextension. It sounds strong on television, but strength without preparation is often just recklessness wearing a louder tie. By the time Washington was still processing the morning outburst, the markets opened at 9:30 into a cloud of uncertainty. Energy stocks whipped around. The Canadian dollar dipped at first as traders reacted to the raw shock of the headlines. And for a brief moment, Trump allies seized on that initial reaction as proof that the pressure campaign was already working. They pointed to the currency move and declared Canada was rattled. But experienced traders know that the first move in a confrontation is often fear, not judgment. Uncertainty always creates selling. The smarter question is, what happens when the other side answers? That was the true suspense hanging over the next several hours. Not whether Trump had made noise. Not whether the noise was dramatic. It certainly was. The real question was whether Carney would meet chaos with chaos, or whether he had something more dangerous prepared. And here is where the silence became its own signal. For roughly 4.5 hours after Trump's public barrage, Mark Carney said nothing. No immediate statement. No reactive post. No angry spokesperson dispatched to television. No visible emotional response at all. Just silence. On cable panels and political talk shows, that silence was instantly misread. Trump allies took victory laps. Commentators declared that Canada had been stunned. Some said Carney was hiding. Others argued that Ottawa now understood it had picked a fight it could not win. The confidence from Trump's side was loud, almost celebratory. But that confidence rested on a fatal misunderstanding. They were treating silence as hesitation, when in fact silence can also mean sequencing. It can mean the answer has already been drafted and the clock is simply being chosen. And that is the first big lesson from this confrontation. A reactive leader hears silence and assumes fear. A prepared leader uses silence like a blade, waiting for the exact moment when the cut will land deepest. Trump's camp seemed to believe that because Canada was not shouting back, Canada must be scrambling. What they failed to consider was far more dangerous. Maybe Ottawa was not improvising at all. Maybe Ottawa was simply waiting for the right minute to open the package it had already built. For 4.5 hours after the morning barrage, Mark Carney gave the public absolutely nothing. No emotional rebuttal. No outraged social media thread. No hurried press room appearance. No leaks designed to calm the press. Just a wall of silence so complete that television networks began filling the gap with speculation and Trump's allies mistook that silence for weakness. Across conservative media, the narrative formed fast. Canada was stunned. Carney had been caught off guard. Ottawa had finally realized it was overmatched. One on-air ally of Trump sneered that this was what happened when a polished replacement tried to play hardball with the leader of the free world. The confidence was loud, but it was built on a catastrophic misread. Because behind that silence, nothing suggested panic. Quite the opposite. The machinery on Carney's side appeared to move with the discipline of a team that had anticipated the exact scenario long before this morning ever began. The working assumption inside Ottawa, according to the narrative laid out by the original account, was that Trump would eventually deliver a public, personal escalation with economic threats and little internal coordination. In other words, not a surprise but a probability. And if you prepare for a probability, instead of merely hoping it never happens, then the response stops being improvisation and starts becoming doctrine. That is what made the silence so dangerous. It was not emptiness. It was staging. The account describes Carney's team as having prepared several preloaded response frameworks, effectively war-gamed counterstrike protocols for different styles of Trump escalation. Today, the situation allegedly matched one of those scenarios almost perfectly: a personal public attack paired with uncoordinated economic threats. That meant the broad architecture of the answer was already done before the first angry post ever went live. Rebuttals had been drafted. Legal pathways had been checked. Allied governments had allegedly been warned in advance what kind of signal to expect and when to release supporting language. The 4.5 hours were not spent inventing a defense. They were spent aligning the final timing, confirming the execution sequence, and making sure each layer would hit in the right order. And let's stop there for a second, because this is where the contrast becomes brutal. One leader was apparently governing minute to minute, mood to mood, camera to camera. The other side was treating the confrontation like an operations room exercise. That is not just a difference in style. That is the difference between a detonation and a controlled demolition. Anyone can lash out. Very few can absorb the first hit, say nothing, and use the other side's momentum against them. According to the structure described in the source material, those silent hours were used for 3 specific tasks. First, final coordination calls with allied governments to confirm that previously prepared statements were ready for release once the signal came. Second, verification that the economic countermeasures were not just politically attractive but legally activated and operationally executable. Third, precise timing calibration, because the response was designed to land at 12:30 in the afternoon, after markets had spent enough time absorbing fear, but before the trading day ended. In other words, the message would not merely answer Trump politically. It would arrive at the exact moment when traders, investors, and institutions were still in position to immediately price the contrast. Even the clock became a weapon. That is what stands out. The silence was not passive. The silence was an instrument. The longer the uncertainty lingered, the more the market could wobble under the shock of Trump's threats. Then, when the response came, calm and sourced and operational, the reversal could be sharper. Fear first, clarity second. And markets, more often than politicians, know how to tell the difference between bluff and preparedness. That was the battlefield Carney seemed ready to use. At 12:30 this afternoon, Carney finally spoke from the floor of Parliament in a 15-minute address that was almost engineered to be the opposite of Trump's morning performance. If Trump had been heat, Carney was ice. If Trump had been improvisation, Carney was structure. Every sentence sounded sourced. Every claim sounded checked. Every rebuttal carried the tone of a man who did not need to shout because the numbers were already doing the damage for him. There was no visible anger, no theatrical indignation, no bid to win the argument with volume. He simply took Trump's 3 threats one by one and dismantled them with data. On banking restrictions, Carney's argument was devastating precisely because it was technical. He noted that Canadian financial institutions hold $2.4 trillion in global assets and process more than $600 billion in cross-border transactions annually. The point was not to boast. The point was to remind Washington that Canadian banks are not some side alley to American finance. They are woven into it. Restricting them would not be a clean punishment aimed northward. It would ricochet through American lending, mortgage processing, and commercial transactions that depend on stable cross-border financial channels. Carney's framing, as reconstructed in the original account, was almost professorial. He was not begging. He was explaining to the White House that parts of the American system would be wounding themselves if these threats were carried through. That kind of rebuttal lands harder than an insult because it strips away fantasy. It tells the audience that what sounded powerful at 8 this morning may not even survive contact with the system it claims to command. And once a threat is exposed as potentially self-destructive, its aura collapses. That is what Carney seemed to understand. In a trade confrontation, humiliation does not come from loud words. It comes from forcing your opponent to watch his own threats turn into evidence against him. On the energy import freeze, Carney reportedly moved to another pressure point with the same methodical calm. He argued that the United States imports 60% of its crude oil from Canada. Not 20, not 30. 60. An import freeze, he warned, would push American gasoline prices up by roughly $1.40 per gallon within 30 days. And he did not leave that estimate hanging as a political opinion. He anchored it to named analysts from Goldman Sachs, the International Energy Agency, and Wood Mackenzie, making the number sound less like a partisan talking point and more like a consensus warning from institutions markets already respect. That was a smart move. Because in political conflict, the source of the number matters almost as much as the number itself. A politician saying prices will spike can be dismissed as rhetoric. A politician citing multiple independent analysts by name is doing something more serious. He is building a chain of credibility. He is telling markets, voters, and allied governments that this is not just Ottawa defending itself. This is arithmetic. And arithmetic is very difficult to bully. Carney's message, in essence, was that if Washington wants to freeze Canadian energy, Washington will have to explain the result to American drivers staring at fuel pumps. Then came the legal strike on the USMCA withdrawal threat. Carney's team, according to the source narrative, had a constitutional and treaty-based analysis ready. The agreement, he argued, requires 6 months' notice and direct congressional involvement under Article 34.6. In plain terms, the president cannot simply pull the United States out by executive impulse, by a parking lot press statement, or by a burst of social media posts. The structure of the agreement itself limits that fantasy. Here again, the genius of the rebuttal was not just that it challenged Trump, it made Trump appear less informed than the document he himself had once celebrated. And that is a brutal thing to do in public life. Not to call someone reckless, not to call him cruel, but to calmly imply that he has threatened something he may not even have the unilateral power to do. Because once that idea gets into the bloodstream of the media cycle, every future threat is weakened. People start asking not whether he wants to do it, but whether he can. And in politics, that distinction can shred the image of command faster than any direct insult ever could. Carney's address did not rely on outrage because outrage would have lowered him into Trump's chosen arena. Instead, he turned the arena itself. Trump had come looking for a shouting match. Carney gave him a stress test. Trump had offered provocation. Carney answered with audited consequences. The effect was cumulative. Threat 1 looked economically reckless. Threat 2 looked politically suicidal. Threat 3 looked legally shaky. By the end of the address, the morning's aggressive posture from Washington no longer felt like dominance. It felt like overreach. And then, almost simultaneously, the second layer hit. Canada did not stop at dismantling the threats rhetorically. It activated targeted economic countermeasures designed not as broad revenge, but as precision pressure. That distinction is crucial. Broad tariffs are the blunt hammer of statecraft. They can make headlines, but they also spread pain in every direction, often hurting the country swinging the hammer. The measures described here were sharper, targeted, selective, built not just to retaliate, but to generate pressure inside the political coalition Trump depends on. The first move was the immediate suspension of potash export facilitation to 6 American agricultural states: Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Indiana, Missouri, and Ohio. Potash is not some decorative commodity. It is essential fertilizer. Canada supplies roughly 30% of the world's potash, and American agriculture depends heavily on that flow. Without potash, corn yields can fall by 30 to 40%. Soybean economics become unstable. Planting season becomes a political emergency. The timing of this measure was the whole point. Pre-planting season is when supply decisions matter most, when uncertainty is not abstract but operational. Farmers do not negotiate with ideology when they are staring at input shortages. They call elected officials, and that is where strategy turns viciously effective. Carney's measure, as described, did not target random parts of America. It aimed at the agricultural heartland, at states with Republican senators, at places where the pressure would be immediate, personal, and electorally expensive. The idea was not merely to punish Washington from the outside. The idea was to make Washington feel pain from the inside, to make voters, farm suppliers, and state-level power brokers pick up the phone and ask why a morning social media outburst had just endangered their planting season. That is not retaliation in the emotional sense. That is battlefield shaping. It forces the opponent's own coalition to become the messenger of consequence. And when that happens, the White House is no longer just dealing with a foreign government. It is dealing with its own side demanding answers. That is when a foreign counterpunch becomes a domestic political problem. The second economic move targeted energy through a quieter channel. Canada reportedly issued formal notice to 3 major pipeline operators that future capacity allocation reviews would prioritize Pacific and Atlantic export commitments over United States-bound flows. It was not a cinematic act. No valves slammed shut. No dramatic embargo was announced. Just paperwork, guidance, allocation language. But markets understand paperwork when paperwork points to future scarcity. Refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast that rely on Canadian heavy crude suddenly had to consider medium-term supply risk. And supply risk becomes price risk, almost instantly. This kind of move is far more elegant than a blunt cutoff because it avoids the spectacle while still creating pressure. It tells the market that the flow is no longer politically guaranteed. It tells companies to rethink assumptions. It tells consumers eventually that costs may rise not because oil vanished overnight, but because certainty did. And certainty is a major currency in energy markets. Once uncertainty enters, everything gets more expensive. That is how a technical administrative signal can become a political weapon without ever looking theatrical. The third move extended the battlefield into capital itself. Canadian pension funds and institutional investors were reportedly given official guidance to accelerate what Ottawa called sovereign risk diversification. The phrase sounds bureaucratic, almost bloodless, but translated into political English, it meant reducing exposure to American markets and redirecting capital elsewhere. The amount associated with that signal, according to the account, was more than $400 billion in stable long-term institutional capital. The money does not flee in one dramatic overnight flood, but that is not how signaling works. What matters first is not the exit itself. It is the warning that the exit lane has been opened. And when a government quietly indicates that a major pool of patient capital may begin seeing the United States as a higher sovereign risk destination, investors hear something far larger than one bilateral spat. They hear a reputational downgrade forming in slow motion. They hear that the country issuing threats in the morning may be teaching its own allies to price in instability by the afternoon. That is a serious wound, because capital can forgive hostility more easily than it forgives unpredictability. So, by early afternoon, the shape of the counterstrike was clear. Trump had thrown broad public threats built on spectacle. Carney responded with a 3-layer system. Disarm the threats with verified data, activate pressure points aimed at Trump's political base, and let the market translate the contrast into cost. It was not flashy in the way morning television craves. It was something much more dangerous. It was structured, and structured responses tend to age better than emotional ones, because every hour after the event usually makes them look smarter. But the counterstrike did not stop with economic pressure. The third layer was diplomatic, and this is the moment when the scale of preparation suddenly became visible to the entire world. Within roughly 90 minutes after Carney finished his address, 5 allied governments released public statements. The United Kingdom spoke first, noting that Canada's measured and data-driven response stood in sharp contrast to what it described as provocative rhetoric coming from Washington. Japan followed, reaffirming its economic commitments with Canada and expressing concern about unilateral threats between allied nations. The European Union issued language emphasizing that trade disputes between partners should be handled through established frameworks and dialogue, not social media ultimatums. Australia added its voice soon after, reaffirming strategic partnership with Canada and support for rules-based international commerce. Then South Korea joined the line, warning against unprovoked economic threats directed at allied governments. 5 governments, 5 statements, all arriving within roughly an hour and a half of Carney's speech. That kind of diplomatic choreography does not happen spontaneously. Heads of government do not write synchronized responses on short notice while juggling their own domestic schedules. Statements like that are prepared ahead of time. The wording is circulated. The timing is agreed upon. The release windows are coordinated, which means the implication was obvious to anyone who has ever worked inside diplomacy. Ottawa had already prepared for the moment when Washington would escalate publicly. Carney's team had likely told those governments weeks earlier that when a certain kind of provocation appeared, this would be the signal to answer together. The call from Ottawa would not ask them to invent language. It would simply tell them the moment had arrived. And when that moment came at 12:30 this afternoon, the diplomatic dominoes began to fall almost immediately. Now pause for a moment and absorb what that means. Trump's goal that morning had been to isolate Canada, to make Ottawa appear weak, dependent, and exposed. Yet within a few hours, the optics flipped completely. Instead of Canada standing alone under pressure, 6 advanced economies appeared aligned around a message that criticized the United States, one country shouting across the border, several countries responding with calm institutional language. The symbolism alone was devastating. And here is where the strategic brilliance becomes impossible to ignore. Trump thought he was initiating a confrontation, but in reality, he had stepped into a scenario the other side had already rehearsed. The social media posts at 7:15 in the morning were not just an attack. They were a trigger. Once the trigger fired, the prepared sequence began to unfold. The speech, the economic measures, the allied statements, each step reinforcing the same narrative: preparation against impulse. It is almost like watching 2 generals walk into the same battlefield with completely different assumptions. One believes he is beginning a war. The other has already drawn the map, placed the artillery, and chosen the hour of engagement. The moment the first shot is fired, the rest of the trap snaps shut. And when observers around the world replayed the timeline later, that is exactly how the day looked. Trump brought 6 angry posts written in under an hour. Carney brought a 247-page economic assessment detailing how each threat could be countered. Trump arrived with 3 unvetted threats announced on live television. Carney answered with 3 targeted economic responses that had already been vetted by economists, lawyers, and cabinet officials. Trump relied on anger. Carney relied on structure. Trump relied on spectacle. Carney relied on allies who had been quietly waiting for the signal. Just think about the psychological difference for a moment. One leader wakes up angry, scrolls through television commentary, and reaches for his phone. The other leader wakes up already knowing that if this confrontation happens today, the folders are prepared, the numbers are checked, and the international support is ready to activate. That is not just preparation. That is strategic patience. And patience in geopolitics is often the difference between winning the day and losing the decade. By the time the afternoon unfolded, financial markets had begun delivering their own verdict. Markets do not care about insults. They care about risk. They measure probability. They evaluate whether leaders appear predictable, stable, and capable of executing what they say. And what traders saw on this day was a textbook contrast. The Canadian dollar strengthened against the United States dollar after Carney's response clarified the situation. Agricultural futures in the targeted American states surged as fertilizer supply concerns suddenly became real. Corn, soybeans, and wheat prices jumped as traders recalculated the possibility of restricted potash flows. Energy stocks also reacted. Companies dependent on Canadian crude began factoring in the possibility that pipeline allocations might shift away from United States refineries toward other export routes. That possibility alone can change pricing models overnight. Financial stocks softened as the signal about Canadian institutional capital diversifying away from American markets circulated through investment desks. Even if the capital does not move immediately, the announcement itself changes the perceived reliability of those funds. And when perception changes, pricing follows. By the closing bell, the pattern across the markets looked unmistakable. Trade-sensitive sectors in the United States carried the heaviest declines. Investors were not celebrating the morning's confrontation. They were recalculating the cost of it. Meanwhile, the Canadian currency stabilized and strengthened, suggesting that traders believed Ottawa's response had contained the immediate threat. Markets had essentially conducted their own referendum on the day's events, and their answer leaned toward preparation over impulse. Meanwhile, inside Washington, the tone shifted dramatically. The morning had been loud. Cameras, microphones, posts flying across every platform. But the afternoon became strangely quiet. The White House did not immediately escalate. There were no follow-up declarations clarifying the earlier threats, no new announcements about banking restrictions, no detailed plan for freezing energy imports. Just silence. Behind that silence, advisors reportedly scrambled to determine which of the president's morning commitments were actually possible. Lawyers examined treaty obligations. Economic staff tried to model the consequences of disrupting fertilizer supplies during planting season. Political aides looked nervously toward senators whose states depended heavily on agriculture and energy stability. The atmosphere, according to multiple reports circulating that afternoon, had shifted from aggressive confidence to urgent damage control. Because once Canada activated those potash restrictions, the political consequences began appearing immediately. Senators representing the affected states started calling the White House. Iowa's delegation warned about the risks to farmers preparing for planting season. Nebraska officials raised concerns about fertilizer supply chains. Ohio's representatives demanded briefings on the trade implications. One senator from Kansas reportedly delivered the bluntest message of all. Farmers cannot plant without fertilizer, so fix the situation quickly or the issue will become public. This is the point where the brilliance of the targeting becomes obvious. Carney did not just push back internationally. He redirected pressure into the domestic American political system. Instead of Washington confronting Ottawa alone, Washington suddenly faced angry calls from its own agricultural heartland. The countermeasures had turned a foreign policy confrontation into a domestic political problem. That transformation is incredibly powerful in trade conflicts, because governments can ignore criticism from abroad for a long time, but when their own voters start demanding answers, the calculus changes instantly. Farmers worrying about crop yields do not care about geopolitical theater. They care about fertilizer deliveries and planting schedules. When those practical concerns collide with a trade dispute triggered by morning social media posts, political patience evaporates quickly. And that is exactly what seemed to happen by mid-afternoon. The White House now faced a dilemma created by its own opening move. Escalating further risked deepening the agricultural crisis. Backing down risked appearing weak after such aggressive rhetoric. In strategic terms, the administration had maneuvered itself into a narrow corridor where every option carried cost. International observers noticed the same dynamic almost immediately. Diplomats across Europe and Asia began commenting privately on the extraordinary contrast between the two approaches. On one side stood a government that appeared to act first and evaluate consequences later. On the other stood a government that appeared to anticipate the confrontation weeks in advance and prepare each response layer carefully. And in international politics, reputation is a currency. Governments sign trade agreements, investment frameworks, and security partnerships based partly on trust that the other side will behave predictably. When leaders demonstrate that they plan, coordinate, and respect institutional processes, they become safer partners. When leaders demonstrate that policy may appear suddenly on social media without internal review, uncertainty spreads quickly. For Canada, the day's events unexpectedly strengthened its diplomatic standing. Ottawa looked composed, methodical, and allied. For the United States, the optics were more complicated. Even if Washington remained economically powerful, the spectacle of impulsive threats followed by quiet damage control raised uncomfortable questions about governance style. And those questions did not remain inside diplomatic circles for long. By the evening, one of the most respected voices in global finance stepped forward to describe exactly what he believed the world had witnessed that day. Warren Buffett, speaking during a Berkshire Hathaway shareholder event later that evening, offered an assessment that cut deeper than any partisan commentary could. Because Buffett does not speak like a politician. He speaks like an investor evaluating management quality. And when he explained what he saw in the confrontation between Trump and Carney, the language sounded less like politics and more like a performance review for two CEOs running rival companies on the global stage. Later that evening, as the dust from the day's confrontation was still settling, one voice delivered an assessment that carried unusual weight across the financial world. Warren Buffett, speaking during a Berkshire Hathaway shareholder gathering, stepped back from the political noise and framed what had happened in terms he has used for more than 70 years. Management competence. Buffett has spent a lifetime studying leaders, CEOs, founders, executives, trying to determine which ones guide organizations toward stability and which ones steer them toward risk. And what he said about the events of this day cut through the entire spectacle with surgical clarity. He began with a principle he has repeated throughout decades of evaluating companies. Preparation, he explained, is the single most reliable signal of competence. When a chief executive walks into an earnings call ready for questions that have not even been asked yet, investors feel confident. When that same executive walks in, improvising answers under pressure, investors feel something else entirely. They feel uncertainty. And uncertainty, Buffett reminded the audience, always carries a cost. That observation might sound simple, but its implications are enormous. Markets do not reward improvisation during high-stakes situations. Improvisation may look dramatic in a headline, but in finance and governance it usually signals something far less glamorous. Someone was not ready. Someone did not do the homework. And when leaders of major institutions operate without preparation, the bill does not arrive immediately, but it always arrives eventually. Then Buffett addressed the events of the day directly. He said that what the world had witnessed was a confrontation between two completely different leadership styles. One leader responded to a televised remark with immediate anger, 6 social media posts in less than an hour, and 3 economic threats announced publicly without internal review. The other leader answered with a prepared framework, a speech built on verified data, targeted economic responses activated within hours, and coordinated diplomatic support from 5 allied governments. Buffett paused and delivered a sentence that quickly traveled across financial newsrooms that night. One leader improvised, the other prepared. And when those two forces collide, the outcome is rarely surprising. Now listen carefully to that logic, because it explains why the markets reacted the way they did. Investors are not evaluating personality. They are evaluating systems. A government that appears to make policy through emotional reaction becomes a risk variable. A government that appears to anticipate scenarios and prepare responses becomes an asset. Risk and assets are priced differently. Buffett went further, breaking down the morning's threats as if he were evaluating a management team in a corporate boardroom. The president had announced 3 economic measures on live television. None of them, according to the narrative circulating that evening, had been assessed by his economic advisors beforehand. None had been modeled for secondary consequences. One of them, the threat of unilateral withdrawal from the USMCA, did not even appear to be legally executable without congressional involvement. That kind of behavior, Buffett implied, would terrify investors if it occurred inside a public company. Imagine a chief executive announcing sweeping operational changes on live television without consulting the legal department, without consulting the finance team, and without checking whether the action was even within his authority. Shareholders would not celebrate that behavior. They would panic. And that is exactly how global markets respond when governments behave the same way. Meanwhile, Canada's response suggested something completely different. Carney's team appeared to have anticipated the escalation scenario weeks earlier. They had prepared economic data explaining the consequences of banking restrictions. They had supply models ready for the energy sector. They had a detailed legal explanation regarding treaty withdrawal procedures. And when the confrontation arrived, they did not scramble for answers. They opened the files and delivered them. That difference, the ability to answer instantly with credible information, is what Buffett considers the ultimate indicator of leadership quality. It means the planning happened before the crisis. It means the institution is not reacting blindly. It means someone inside the system asked the difficult questions early. And that, according to Buffett, is exactly what markets reward. He explained that markets are brutally honest observers. They do not have loyalty to political parties or national pride. They do not care who shouted louder during a press conference. They watch behavior. They evaluate competence. Then they price the result. And on this day, they priced 2 signals. One signal was unpredictability policy emerging suddenly from emotion, delivered publicly before internal review. The other signal was preparation data ready, alliances coordinated, countermeasures activated methodically. Those 2 signals traveled across trading desks in seconds. By early afternoon, traders had already begun adjusting positions. The Canadian dollar strengthened relative to the United States currency after the response clarified the situation. Agricultural futures spiked in the American states most exposed to potash supply risk. Energy equities dipped as refineries recalculated possible shifts in Canadian crude flows. Financial stocks softened as investors absorbed the signal that Canadian institutional capital might diversify away from American markets. These movements were not ideological reactions. They were mathematical reactions. When fertilizer supply for key crops becomes uncertain, corn and soybean futures move. When crude supply reliability is questioned, energy companies adjust valuations. When a government hints that hundreds of billions of dollars in pension capital may shift abroad, bond and equity markets take notice. That is the language markets speak. Buffett summarized the situation in a way that resonated far beyond the shareholder meeting. He said the market had essentially watched 2 leaders approach the same confrontation with completely different toolkits. One toolkit contained emotion, spontaneity, and public spectacle. The other contained data, coordination, and strategic timing. And when investors choose which environment they trust, the answer tends to be obvious. But Buffett's most unsettling observation came near the end of his remarks. He warned that the real damage from such an episode may not appear immediately in currency charts or stock indexes. The deeper damage appears in reputation. When the leader of the world's largest economy appears to make economic threats impulsively before consulting advisors, before evaluating consequences, every other government on earth begins recalibrating how it deals with that country. That recalibration does not disappear overnight. Trade partners become cautious. Investors begin adding risk premiums. Negotiators start demanding additional guarantees before committing to long-term agreements. The perception that policy might change suddenly based on emotion rather than analysis becomes a structural concern. And once that perception spreads, it can take years to rebuild trust. That was Buffett's warning. Carney's preparation did not merely neutralize the threats of that morning. It exposed the absence of preparation on the other side. And exposure is permanent. Once the world sees how a government behaves under pressure, the image becomes part of every future negotiation. Think about the implications for a moment. If you are the European Union preparing a long-term trade framework, which partner seems more predictable? If you are Japan deciding where to allocate billions in industrial investment, which environment appears more stable? If you are a sovereign wealth fund managing pension capital for the next 20 years, which leadership style feels safer? The answers begin writing themselves. By nightfall, the entire sequence of the day had become clear. Early this morning, Donald Trump saw a television interview that angered him. Within minutes, he launched 6 social media posts and publicly threatened sweeping economic retaliation against Canada. Those threats were announced before his own economic team had evaluated them, before legal advisors had reviewed them, and before the diplomatic consequences had been considered. Within hours, Mark Carney delivered a structured response built on verified economic data. Canada activated targeted countermeasures aimed at agricultural states critical to Trump's political coalition. 5 allied governments released coordinated statements reinforcing Canada's position. Financial markets recalculated risk across currencies, commodities, and equities. And by the end of the trading day, the verdict from investors was unmistakable. Preparation had beaten impulse. This entire confrontation was never simply about tariffs or fertilizer or pipelines. It was about governance philosophy. One side treated leadership as a sequence of reactions to daily provocations. The other treated leadership as a strategic discipline that anticipates those provocations before they arrive. Trump's call-out was intended to demonstrate strength. Instead, it revealed vulnerability, the vulnerability of a system where policy can emerge from emotion before analysis. Carney's response was intended to show that Canada had prepared for exactly such a scenario. And the precision of that preparation suggested Ottawa had spent weeks studying the possible paths of escalation. That is why the confrontation felt so uneven once the timeline became visible. One leader began the day angry and reached for a phone. The other began the day ready. And when the next crisis arrives, whether tomorrow morning or months from now, the world will remember which of those signals the markets trusted. If this story made you think, leave a comment with your perspective. Tap like if you want more deep analysis of global power struggles, and subscribe so you never miss the next breakdown of the forces shaping the world.